Good evening, class. This is the remake of the previous lecture that was kind of, because of the limitations of technology, I had to go out and get a webcam for my desktop because my poor little laptop was sounding like Max Headroom. So, if you've already watched part of the lecture, this, of course, hopefully will not be any different than the previous lecture, only better production quality. Now, of course, up until last class period, we have been talking about the Industrial Revolution, its social effects, and how the Industrial Revolution helped drive the emergence of modern nationalism. Now, of course, usually I talk about nationalism after talking about the ideological effects of industrialization, but because of the missed day due to the great train derailment, we've kind of had to work around that. But as I told you guys during the last class period, you need to watch this entire lecture because hopefully you guys will see how these post-industrial ideologies affect us today, because you've heard terms like socialism and communism. But in this lecture, we're going to talk about what they are. We're going to talk about how they differ from what we would call the free market. Where do they come from? What are the key points in these ideologies? We will also talk about corporatism, which most of you have not heard. But if you look around, you look at the American government, you look at governments in the West, it is very pronounced. We will also talk about progressivism of the early 20th century. And hopefully you will see how much of an impact, whether you agree with it or not, I think it's pretty much undeniable that it has had an impact. But you will see what the core tenets of progressivism are, and of course how they've changed, particularly the United States and American society. Now, before we get started, I did this at the beginning of the previous lecture. I think I will do it again because I think that I cannot drive it home enough to show how industrialization and the fast pace of industrial development has shaped our society. Most of us take the world around us for granted, the fact that we can go to a store and buy stuff at a relatively cheap price. The stuff is relatively identical. You know, you have racks and racks of the exact same shirt on the clothes, in the clothes departments of Walmart or Target. Most of us have in our pocket identical iPhone 4s or iPhone 5s or iPhone 6s. I just received this in the mail. It looks like a giant brick made by a radio company, RCA here. This is actually a battery. Most people would not recognize it as such, but it is a radio battery. It provides two different voltages, in this case 9 volts and 90 volts, to this. This is a 1946 Philco portable radio, and as you can tell, the battery, when inserted, takes up a good portion of what's inside the case. Now, this case right now is empty. I'm restoring the actual guts, so you can see it's kind of vacant in there, but you can see quite large. That being said, even though I love old tube radios, voila. A little computer in your pocket compared to an AM radio. The wonders of technology. And the question I want to put to you guys, we can easily see how portable computers, smartphones, have quickly rechanged or readjusted, reshaped our society. We can see how today people don't read books. They just simply say, hey, I can look it up on Google on my phone. I've got an app for that. And of course, this is a relatively new development, less than 20 years old. Think about the jarring effect that industrialization had on Western society. That in 1700, or I should say in 1800, most Western countries were still rural, agricultural. Life was dictated by the rhythm of nature. By 1900, those same exact countries in Europe and the United States were highly industrialized, with dense population centers, with urban problems, with two new social classes that we talked about, trying to come up with their own new identities, the working class and the middle class. All of these social problems, social tensions, would give impetus for thinkers to basically take this as an opportunity to reshape society, to use the Industrial Revolution and its effects as an excuse to put forward their ideas of what society should be. Almost from the beginning, people rejected this Industrial Revolution. We talked about how inventors like the Englishman, John Kay, and another Englishman, James Hargreaves, revolutionized the textile industry by inventing the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny. Later, the spinning jenny was improved upon, and you have the mule. Well, most of you didn't know that John Kay had his home almost burnt down when angry weavers attacked his home in 1753. Likewise, James Hargreaves had his factory that made spinning jennies attacked in 1764. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, you have a protest movement in England known as the Luddites. Now today, if somebody calls you a Luddite, they're basically saying that you are a person who rejects technology, that you reject modern society. Well, the Luddites rejected modern industrial society. They rejected the industrialization, the mechanization of their industry, of their livelihood. Now, the Luddites get their name from an almost fictional character by the name of Ned Ludd. Now, Ned Ludd is a character in history that we historians really can't prove existed. If he did exist, he was probably not the man of myth. Like Robin Hood, Ned Ludd became embellished. This identity became almost superhuman in what he could do and how he could lead this protest movement. The Luddites, in general, were people who worked in the textile industry, mainly men, who tried to destroy the Industrial Revolution in the textile industry. They did so by trying to destroy the power looms that we talked about, burning factories down, textile mills. In England in the early 1800s, this violence became so bad that the British Parliament actually passed a series of laws making it a capital offense. That means you could get hung for this. A capital offense to destroy industrial machinery. So For those people being directly affected by industrialization, you see them violently trying to strike back. And this is not limited to England. Like England, the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Holland, and Belgium were undergoing an industrial revolution based around textiles in the early 1800s. Their textile workers took their traditional shoes, you know, those Dutch wooden shoes, and tried to halt the march of technology by throwing their shoes into the machines, hence inaugurating a period of industrial sabotage, because the name of the traditional Dutch shoes are sabots. So on one level of society, we have those people who are being directly affected by the Industrial Revolution and trying to halt it by protest and even violence. At the same time, at the what you might call a higher level of society, the educated classes were rejecting the Industrial Revolution as well. It is during this period between 1800 and the 1850s that you see the growth, culmination, and finally the decline of what becomes known as the Romantic movement or Romanticism. Romanticism can't really be considered a modern ideology because an ideology is a set of ideas that is all-encompassing. If you believe in an ideology, you believe that the world should be reshaped completely, economically, politically, socially, religiously, should be reshaped according to your ideology. And Romanticism is more of an artistic movement, a philosophical movement. It's a philosophical movement that stresses the human character. Most of these romantic authors, poets, composers, and even architects believe that the Enlightenment combined with industrialization was robbing humanity of its character, its core. And thus, they rejected industrialization, instead focusing upon what they considered what was key to humanity. We see this best in Romantic literature. I doubt most of you guys in the class have read Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, but some of the young ladies may have read these. Of course, these are the works of Jane Austen. Jane Austen, an English author, stressed in almost all of her books the agricultural, the rural, the sublime, the pastoral, the emotional. The plots of her books, from what I've read, because I'll be honest, I have not read Jane Austen, but from what I've read, it's kind of like Cliff Notes, they pretty much revolve around the same thing. Love, competition for a suitor, intrigue in family affairs such as one family against another. They're not interested in corporate developments, industrial technologies. They're not interested in mass production. And rarely do you see characters in Jane Austen books talking about politics. Instead, these books revolve around personal relationships. The Romantics were not limited to literature either. In England, the Low Countries, France, Germany, and to a lesser extent Italy, you see Romantic writers and composers and poets stressing this need for humanity. In England, for example, you might recognize some of the names, like, for example, John Keats. Keats was a well-known and still a well-known poet from the Romantic age. If you guys are taking English, British Lit, for example, you'll probably read some Keats or William Wordsworth. A little tongue-tied right there. You might read some Walter Scott. You may read some Mary Shelley. We'll talk about Mary Shelley here in just a minute. If you're into music, you might listen to some German composers, Beethoven, for example, or Wagner. Most of you would recognize Ride of the Valkyries. Bum 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 bum. One thing about both Wagner and Beethoven is the kind of the hard-hitting, powerful notes, which contrast with sort of the ethereal music of composers like Mozart. Very high-pitched, kind of angelic kind of music. Beethoven and Wagner are not that. Instead, it's music that hits you here in the chest. Music that has been borrowed by modern musicians, even rock musicians, because it fits. It fits. It's a driving music. Even in this country, you see the romantic urge. In this country, the United States, the Romantic era crossed over with another philosophical tradition known as Transcendentalism. You have Thoreau and other poets and authors in this country embracing this idea that industrial society is crass, it's dirty, it's not really human, it's artificial. And it's this artificiality that the Romantics reject and, in a way, fear. In Germany, for example, composers and authors are joined by architects, pioneering what becomes known as Gothic culture. You guys have probably heard of Gothic architecture in the form of Gothic cathedrals. And you may have heard of the Gothic novel. A classic Gothic novel, of course, is the work of Mary Shelley, who was not German, but the English wife of an English lord, Lord Byron. Shelley would write a book by the name of The Modern Prometheus. Most of us don't know what the modern Prometheus was or is, but many of us know who Prometheus was, Prometheus being the Greek god that broke Zeus's order to give technology, fire, to mankind. The reason why Prometheus was punished for giving man fire was the gods believed that fire, while constructive, was also incredibly destructive, and that mankind would use this fire not only against the gods, but against mankind as well. You would probably recognize Mary Shelley's novel by its more modern title, Frankenstein. This, of course, is Boris Karloff in our most classic example of Frankenstein, the one that most people recognize. Frankenstein, of course, is not the monster here. Frankenstein is Victor Frankenstein, the scientist who, trying to overcome death through technology, creates something that was highly destructive, that would not only destroy itself, but destroy the doctor as well. In a way, Shelley is warning us what we already know, that technology can be used for the good of humanity, but that same technology can be highly destructive and even destroy humanity. Now, while the Romantics of this age cannot be considered an ideology unto themselves, they do contribute this idea that there's more to human existence than just technology and industrialization. They will contribute to a revival of art, a revival of literature, but they will also contribute to ideologies that we're going to speak of right now. One of them is socialism. Now, socialism in reality is not an old ideology, or not a new ideology, I should say. It's actually quite an old ideology. It traces its roots all the way back to ancient Greece. The Greek philosopher Plato, for example, in Plato's Republic, speaks about how society should be set up communally, so that society should be considered before the individual. Because one of the things that is interesting about many of the ideologies that we're going to talk about today is that they believe that the Enlightenment, followed by industrialization, has had the negative effect of atomizing the population. We think of individual rights, individual responsibilities, individualism in general in a positive way. Well, socialists do not. Socialists believe that individualism can lead to tension, can lead to conflict, and thus conflict destroys society. Now, if we want to talk about modern socialism, really modern socialism has its roots in the 1500s. Sir Thomas More was one of the king's officials under Henry VIII of England. Now, most of you might recognize Henry VIII. Henry VIII was, of course, the king who split the Church of England away from the Catholic Church. Now, before he did this, Sir Thomas More served him as one of his prime officials. However, Sir Thomas More refused to convert to the new religion, and as a result, Henry VIII had him executed, because Henry VIII could not allow such a well-respected official of his court refuse to follow the edicts of the crown. Yet, years before Henry VIII decided to separate from the rest of Europe, Sir Thomas More wrote a short story called Utopia. He actually coined the name Utopia, which today means a perfect society. And so Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which he wrote in the early 1500s, is about a fictional island society somewhere here in the New World. In the 1500s, Europeans had just found out about North and South America, but did not know that much about it. So this was a great place for More to kind of set his story. Now, on the island of Utopia, all property is shared property. It's communally owned. So you share your living quarters. You share the profits of all labor. Like the Spartans, Sir Thomas More's utopians lived in a world where they did not want to see any class distinctions. They didn't want to see one person be, well, better off than the next person. The signs of wealth, like, for example, gold, well, they're not the signs of wealth in Utopia. Instead, gold is used to make the shackles of slaves and prisoners. So in a lot of ways, Sir Thomas More's Utopia is a society that is a flip, a complete opposite of the society that Sir Thomas More lived in. A very hierarchical society where the nobles had vast amounts of wealth compared to the majority of the population in England. Now, we historians still do not know if More's Utopia was merely a fictional tale, a criticism of the society that he lived in, or was it a plan? Was Sir Thomas More putting forward a possible alternative? However, during the Romantic period of the 1800s, so the early 1800s, many Europeans rediscovered Sir Thomas More. They rediscovered this idea of a collective ownership, of communal living. Because at the core of socialism, which I should tell you that socialism is not one unified ideology. There are various branches of socialism, and we'll talk about a few of them here in a minute. There are various branches of socialism, but they have certain key things in common. And one of them is this idea of equality of condition rather than equality of opportunity. Socialists argue that there needs to be at least a base level, if not an absolute equality of condition. So, what are some socialist policies that would guarantee equality of condition? In the very least, public funding of things like healthcare, education. In the extreme, you would have government ownership of factories, banks, transportation networks, communications. These would be collectively owned by the government in the name of the people. In the most extreme examples of socialism, there would be no personal property. The house that you lived in was not yours. All of it was owned by the community for the community good. Because socialists argue that competition is degrading to the individual and destructive of society. They stress cooperation. Now, let's talk about certain breeds of socialism. Now remember, one of the things that they hold in common is this adage here at the very top. To each according to his need, from each according to his ability. Now initially, socialists can best be described as utopian socialists. They get their name not just because they're following the example of Sir Thomas More's Utopia. They believed that they could create a perfect society, a perfect socialist society, by separating themselves from the mainstream society and casting off these ideas of individual ownership, competition, and instead embracing a shared community. Strangely enough, many of these utopian communities are set up here in this country. One reason why they're set up in this country is because there's very little room in Europe for these communities to be set up, whereas in the early and mid-1800s, America is still an open land with plenty of room for these societies, these communities to be formed. In the 1840s, you see the formation of what becomes known as Brook Farm. Brook Farm, which is right outside of Boston, Massachusetts, is set up as an ideal, self-sufficient, socialist community. And as the name suggests, it's based on farming. The idea is that people would live there, share in the labor, share their products. However, by the 1850s, Brook Farm fails. One reason why it fails is most of the people who move to Brook Farm are not farmers. They're intellectuals. They're authors. Like, for example, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne talks about his time at Brook Farm not in a good light, because guess what? You can't do very much writing when you're trying to farm all day. Closer to home here in East Tennessee, you have the foundation of rugby in the 1880s. Even that late, East Tennessee was, well, let's be honest, guys, East Tennessee was kind of like Podunk. I've lived here my entire life, and I'll be willing to admit that. In the 1880s, you see British expatriates come to East Tennessee and set up the town of Rugby, which is located just above Oliver Springs, which is itself just above Oak Ridge. Again, like Brook Farm, Rugby was based on farming, this idea of an ideal agricultural community where everybody shared in the labor. And like Brook Farm, by the 1890s, Rugby would fail. I've actually been to Rugby. It's a nice little community where no one lives. It's on the National Registry because of what it was, but the only person who really lives there is the caretaker, who is, I will tell you, when I was there about 10 years ago, is a very, very lonely man. Why did these things fail? Well, first and foremost, in utopian socialist societies like Rugby and Brook Farm, everything from your house to what you produced was collectively owned. And one of the problems in socialism is, what's the incentive for individuals to produce more? Because if I am going to receive everything that I need, why should I give everything that I have? That is the problem in this adage right here, which is the basis of almost all brands of socialism. Now in France, you see a socialist community formed in Paris by the Frenchman Charles Fourier. Now Fourier is an interesting character in that he sets up a factory that he calls a phalanx. Now, of course, this is not the same thing as the military formation phalanx. But Fourier is one of the founding members of an idea of early socialism called associationalism. It's kind of hard to say there for a minute. Associationalism. Now, this idea is work, according to Fourier, should be pleasurable. That things that we take as things of enjoyment, whether it be music and art, even sex, should be somehow combined with the productive effort of manufacturing. To tell you the truth, I am not well versed enough on Fourier to tell you exactly how this all came out. I would like to see this kind of factory, to tell you the truth. But like Brook Farm and Rugby, Fourier's experiments did not work out. They failed. Another kind of socialism is where individuals attempt to take certain socialist characteristics, certain socialist policies, and combine them with free market capitalism. Now, most of us say, how can this be done? Well, the Englishman Robert Owen did this, and for his lifetime, it was actually successful. What did Robert Owen do? Well, Robert Owen, who owned textile mills in England, moved his textile mills out of the existing urban areas where they were located, building new, more technologically advanced mills, but also building the towns around the mills. Building not only the stores, but building the houses his workers would live in. He would provide his workers with housing. He would provide their children with free schooling. He would provide them with shops. Now, Robert Owen's idea was simple. If these people, if these workers were taken care of, if they could share in the wealth, because that's another thing that he did. If they produced more, they were paid more. If they shared in the wealth, they would take a vested interest in the product, which in this case was textiles. But Robert Owen also speaks to the point that not only would they produce a better product, you would also produce a better worker. Now, on the kind of flip side of this, you also see socialists in England again. England is kind of a hotbed of socialism in the 1800s. You see the rise of the Fabian Society. Now, the Fabians are a very important group because while the utopian socialists, mainly Englishmen who came over here to this country but also set up a few utopian communities in England, while most of them failed, while industrial socialists like Robert Owen were individuals, the Fabian Society would have a lasting effect, not only upon British society, but on world society. I cannot stress this enough, because the Fabian Society would be a popular society in which members of elite British society would attend. I'll name off some of the names of past members, and you will probably recognize them. But one of the interesting things about the Fabians is that the Fabians recognized the major problem that I just discussed up here at the top. That if left to their own devices, if left to voluntary action, what they called voluntary socialism would fail. One of the most influential Fabian members was a woman by the name of Annie Besant. Now, Annie Besant was born in the late 1800s, would spend most of her life in India, would actually help Mahatma Gandhi form the Indian National Congress. But she was an active member in the Fabian and a socialist. And this is what she has to say about the problems of voluntary socialism and what the solution is. But the general idea is that each man should have power according to his knowledge and capacity. And the keynote is that of my fairy state. From every man according to his capacity, to every man according to his needs. A democratic socialism controlled by majority votes, guided by numbers, can never succeed. A truly aristocratic socialism, controlled by duty, guided by wisdom, is the next step towards civilization. Now, what is she getting at? She's basically arguing that while you should have socialism for the masses, where they share in the goods, everything is collectively owned, the collective ownership is controlled by the state, and the state is not directly controlled by the people, what she called democratic socialism. Instead, it is controlled by an elite. That the learned elite knows what's best for society and thus can guide society to a better form of civilization. This is the basics of Fabian socialism. Now, who are some of these Fabian socialists? Well, as I said, Annie Besant would be well known in circles both in Britain and in India. Another member of the Fabian Society, and I'm probably going to butcher his name and I'm going to apologize beforehand, is the first Prime Minister of India, the man who was literally Mahatma Gandhi's right-hand man before he was assassinated, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. Likewise, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, another associate of Mahatma Gandhi, who would found the modern-day state of Pakistan, was also a member of the Fabian Society. In Britain itself, we have 3 known prime ministers. Clement Attlee, who would take over from Winston Churchill after World War II. You also have men like, for example, Tony Blair, who was the prime minister just before the current prime minister. And before then, you had Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister in the 50s and early 1960s. Why is this important? Well, it's during the tenure of these men that you see socialist policies being introduced in England. Today, England has a national health service. Basically, it is government-paid health care. It's what Obamacare is based off of. It's what they used as a model. The Fabians also advocated public schools. Before the Fabian Society was founded in 1884, Britain did not have public education the way the West has now. You also see the Fabians advocating, well, what you might call slightly darker policies. Because if you believe that a learned elite can better control society, and you believe society should be considered as a whole, anything that is good for society as a whole, even if it means harming certain individuals, should be okay. And one of the things that crops up in the early 1900s is something called eugenics. In the early 1900s, there's an idea based off the teachings and ideas of Charles Darwin. When you combine Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution with the idea that if an animal can evolve from one species to the next, there are steps where that species is getting better and better and better before it makes the transition to another species. Well, in the early 1900s, so-called social Darwinists or eugenicists applied that to human society. And they applied this especially since Europeans were coming into contact with and colonizing other parts of the world with very different cultures. Cultures where people looked a lot different, acted a lot different. And so they started applying this to the globe, saying that, well, certain people are more advanced than others, and thus the lesser advanced societies need to be destroyed. Social Darwinism basically advocates replacing of entire cultures. Eugenics goes one step further by saying it's impossible to re-educate these people. They must be eliminated. And many members of the Fabian Society advocated eugenics policies both outside of Britain and within Britain itself. For example, many Fabian eugenicists advocated the sterilization of certain members of the population, people with criminal backgrounds, people that were committed to insane asylums, women who were arrested for prostitution, for example, people who have proved themselves to be basically the dregs of society. Well, let's just make it so they can't breed. That is the basics of Fabian eugenics policies. This is one thing that the Fabians have been criticized for. But in my opinion, it's this idea of aristocratic control. This idea that the government should be dominated by a small group, supposedly for the benefit of the whole. Because this is going to play into an even more radical form of socialism, and this is, of course, what today we call communism. Communism is the product of these two men right here. This, of course, is Friedrich Engels. This is his more famous co-author, Karl Marx. Communism is based on the belief that society is not driven by people's choices, rational thought. Instead, communism is based on this belief that history is driven by violent class conflict, that the driving force is where the class in power is challenged by what you might call an upstart class, and either the society of the dominant class is reaffirmed as they basically destroy the challenger, or the challenger destroys the dominant class, and thus rewrites society, remakes society in its image, and thus in remaking society sets the groundwork for another class, another challenger class to be born. In the Communist Manifesto, I have my little copy right here, Marx and Engels talk about how from the time of tribal man, you have this class conflict. Because according to Marx and Engels, they borrow from Jean-Jacques Rousseau that in his most primal state, mankind is communistic. That the noble savage Rousseau spoke of is a socialist society. However, once you have the formation of the warrior class dominates the others. And the warrior class will develop until superseded by the patrician class of Rome. The patrician class will facilitate the growth of the plebeian class. The conflict between these two classes will not reaffirm the patrician society in the end, but in the end it will completely destroy Roman society, according to Marx and Engels, setting the stage for the medieval period. In the medieval period, you see the rise of the noble class. However, the noble class will be superseded, will be defeated by the burgeoning, what they come to call bourgeoisie, which is the merchant class, the capitalist class. Of course, when the capitalist class takes over from the feudal class, from the noble class, they remake society. And according to Marx and Engels, this is what the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution represent. This is the time period where this new bourgeois class remakes society. But in doing so, they create a mass class of unskilled workers that Marx and Engels label the proletariat. Now, according to Marx and Engels, the end stage of this human development is where the proletariat in all the countries of the world recognize that they have more in common with other workers than with those people within their own nations, and thus rise up, throw off the shackles of the bourgeois society, and establish the communist utopia. Because according to Marx and Engels, everything in society is nothing more than a reflection of the economic system the dominant class has put in place. So music, art, literature, religion, they're all opiates of the masses. That they're used to dull the senses of the masses. National identity is also used to divide the workers. This is why, of course, Marx is famously quoted as, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." So what is this communist utopia? Well, like many socialist societies, there is no private property. The means of production, the factories, the financial system, the transportation system, communications, are all controlled by the state. You might be asking yourself, however, wait a minute. If the state controls everything, wouldn't a new dominant class form? Well, according to Marx and Engels, the solution is a powerful party, the Communist Party, a party to represent all the proletariat. And thus the party would control the state in the name of the people, and thus you would have what they call the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm going to give you my opinion here, guys, because I think, at best, the idea of the communist utopia is pie in the sky. The problems for communism is that this is violent revolution, not evolution like many socialists argue for, but revolution. In order to destroy the old class, Marx and Engels argue that these old classes must be destroyed themselves. Not just the society that they built, but the individuals within the class themselves. This means mass killing. This means those people that cannot be fit into the proletariat must be done away with. The other classes must be destroyed to only leave the proletariat. Once the proletariat is left, and it's only the proletariat, according to Marx and Engels, the state will vanish. It will fade away. It will wither because there's no need for it. And of course, they put these ideas down, of course, in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. Here we are. I just want to read to you from the manifesto so that you have an understanding of the mindset. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to establish mass democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as a ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitating further inroads upon the old social order and are unavoidable as measures of an entirely revolutionizing mode of production. Even to me, and I've read this before, that makes only partial sense, and it's one giant run-on sentence. But this makes a little bit more sense. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty much applicable. Number one, abolition of private property in land and application of all rent to land for public purposes. Number two, a heavy progressive graduated income tax. Number three, abolition of the right of inheritance. Number four, confiscation of the property of all rebels and immigrants. And when I say immigrants, I don't mean immigrants with an I, people coming into the society, but immigrants with an E, those leaving society. Number five, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly on finance. Number six, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number seven, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of waste lands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Now get number eight, equal obligation to work for all, establishment of industrial armies, especially in agriculture. This basically means you don't have a choice whether you want to work or not. Number nine, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And then finally, number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of child labor, combination of education with industrial production. That is what Marx and Engels call for, to make the transition away from a bourgeois society, a capitalistic society as they call it, and a communist society. Like Fabian socialism, you need to have an elite group, the party in this case, leading the way, and those people who stand in the way of the party will be done away with. Because, like socialists, communists separate society from individuals. Society is no longer just multiple individuals coming together. Society is its own entity. And in order to change that society, if you must, well, deal harshly with certain individuals, Marx and Engels see nothing wrong with it. Now, like communism and socialism, another ideology that is born during this time period also views society as a whole, subordinating individual rights and needs to the corporate body, the corpus. This is why it is called corporatism. Now, like socialism, corporatism is a diverse set of sub-ideologies. So we're going to talk about corporatism as kind of a general ideology. So what is corporatism, and how does it differ from socialism and communism? Well, instead of viewing society as divided among classes, instead of, workers and capitalists, corporatists view the world or view society as what you might call functional groups. This is a term that one of the founders of modern corporatism called it. This is, of course, Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim might be familiar to some of you guys, especially if you take classes in sociology, because sociology is the study of classes and groups within society. And Emil Durkheim helped found the academic discipline of sociology in order to facilitate corporate, and when I say corporate, I don't mean like business development, but political corporate development. Because corporatists believe that democracy is messy. Democracy is inefficient. Democracy does not further the collective good. Instead, what needs to happen is a balancing of the needs of groups within society. That instead of individual-based politics, politics should be based on groups, on functional groups, what you do in society. Now, the simplest corporate model is what's called the tripartisan model, where you have the state balancing labor and management, for example. However, in advanced corporatist societies, it looks more like this. This is modeled after Prussia in the 1870s and Germany in the 1880s. This is a corporatist model. You see, each functional group, business, farming, medical, banking, the military, land management, labor. You will also know that at the top of each list, you see big corporations, corporate farms, large state, government banks, large government unions. And at the bottom, self-employed, non-unionized, small holders, small banks, individual doctors. The reason why this is set up this way is on purpose. In the corporatist mindset, within these functional groups, they are represented by a private organization. And within the private organization, the largest, most successful entities within that group have more representation and more power than the smaller, less successful members. Why? Well, their logic is simple. What is good for society is good for big business, for example, because big business has done something right. Big business is big for a reason. And if big business has been successful, we should replicate what they've been doing overall in society. So how does policy, how are laws passed in this corporatist model? Well, while on the one hand, you have these private groups, like unions, for example, or the Chamber of Commerce over here for business, you have, at the state level, ministries or departments that represent these interests. Like you have a Department of Business, a Department of Agriculture, a Department of Labor. And it is the interaction, the relationship between the private group, the private organization, and the government department that will form policy in respect to that particular industry. And then the departments within the state, within the government, will negotiate with each other so that the interest of, say, business is aligned with policies that are meant for labor, so that you don't have any contradictions. Now, one of the things that you might be asking yourself in this corporatist model, where's the elected officials? Well, in the ideal corporatist models, there are no elected officials. Because again, corporatists argue that only the experts in their field should have power. Democratic elections do not guarantee that the best person will be elected. And thus, the people within these departments are not elected. They are appointed. Now, where do they come from? Well, of course, they're going to come from the very industries that they represent. And are they going to appoint Clay Baird, self-employed, business owner, or are they going to appoint the head of a large corporation like, say, for example, General Electric? I hope you guys can see where I'm going with this. There is no room for voting, for individual political action. This is the state negotiating with the elites within a certain industry, formulating policy. And I hope you guys can see that corporatism exists. I mean, do we have departments that are like this? Do we have a Department of Labor in the United States? Do we have a Department of Agriculture here in the United States? And do these departments formulate policy that have the effect of law? Well, right then and there you have corporatism, maybe not pure corporatism, but corporatism nonetheless being used as, being used as a way of governing. Now, in practice, corporatism can only exist in states that have a government class, a large government, a growing government, and a bureaucratic class. They've got to have government. Corporatism helps grow government, but it needs government. And in Europe, the most pronounced corporate estate of the late 1800s and early 1900s is Prussia, and then later on Germany, when Germany becomes a state around Prussia in 1876. Now, oftentimes when corporatism is viewed, it is seen merely as political corruption. When we see the so-called revolving door between business, elites and government positions back and forth, we say, man, that's corruption. When we see a large corporation lobbying for privileged standing when it comes to government, we say, that's wrong, that's corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, that's corporatism. And that's how it's supposed to work if you're a corporatist. Now let's end up this lecture by talking about an ideology that is uniquely American. Let's talk about progressivism. Because progressivism is another ideology that sees, progressives look upon American society at the turn of the last century and they don't like what they see. They see urban growth, urban problems, social issues, industrial pollution, child labor, poverty, violence, crime, vice. They see all of these things and they want to change society. They want to make society better. Now, what is progressivism? Well, one of the most recent historical works on progressivism is by a historian by the name of Michael McGurr. McGurr finally gives progressivism a philosophical identity, because before McGurr's work, we historians have kind of looked upon progressivism as kind of like a catch-all term for a bunch of reform movements that really were not related to each other, because you have some progressives who want to see the regulation of industry, you see others that want to eliminate child labor, you have some that want to eliminate the production of alcohol, prohibition, for example. You have some progressives who want to champion women's right to vote. What ties them together? Because in a lot of ways, progressivism is kind of like the American melting pot of ideologies, where classical liberal thought, that thought of John Locke, for example, is combined with a little bit of socialism here and a little bit of corporatism there. Well, in short, as we will see, progressives believe that society has to be managed, that there needs to be institutions in place to help change individuals, to help regulate individuals and corporations and and organizations. Initially, progressives attempt to do this on their own. They attempt to change society through individual effort. We see this early on in the efforts of the so-called muckrakers. The muckrakers were normally journalists that, as the name suggests, dug up dirt on corporate abuses, political corruption, like you see here in McClure's magazine, The Labor Boss. One of the most famous muckrakers and one of the most influential ones is a fellow by the name of Upton Sinclair. Now, who was Upton Sinclair? Well, I will tell you that here in a minute because I don't want to bias you against him just yet. Upton Sinclair would get himself hired and work in the meatpacking industry, the meatpacking houses of Chicago. At that time, there was no regulation whatsoever of canning and corporate, basically industrial butchering. So Sinclair chronicles in his book, The Jungle, that is published in 1906, how sides of beef are brought in for processing. Some of them fall off the hooks onto the ground. Back then, there was not the floor of these packing houses was not sanitized tile. Instead, it may be dirt. It most likely was concrete with sawdust there to soak up the blood. Regardless of what it was, these floors were nasty compared to today's standards. Sinclair claims that these ill-trained, basically production line workers disassembling carcasses would sometimes lose fingers, and these fingers would get chopped up with the rest of the meat. Rats would fall down into the giant mixing vats where they're making stuff like ground beef or potted meat or sausages or things like that. When the book comes out in 1906, Americans are so disgusted that the public outcry actually forces Congress to act. 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act is passed, establishing the precedent that the federal government had the right to regulate food production in this country. By 1912, there would be a regulatory agency. Of course, this is the FDA put in place. Now, Sinclair may have not got what he wanted. Because, see, Sinclair was a member of the American Socialist Party. He did not want a regulated industry. He wanted a government-owned, nationalized industry. But the precedent set by the Pure Food and Drug Act is what justifies the numerous alphabet agencies we have in this country today. We have the EPA, we have the ATF, we have various other regulatory agencies. When it comes to labor, you have OSHA. When you have, of course, education, you have the Department of Labor. All of these regulatory agencies and institutions are justified by the precedent set in 1906 by the Pure Food and Drug Act. You also have progressives at this time trying to change society one person at a time. This is best illustrated by this woman right here. This is Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams, like Upton Sinclair, came from an upper middle class background. One reason why these progressives are able to do what they do is they have plenty of discretionary income. While they may not be of the elite, wealthy class of Americans, they have enough money to do what, well, Upton Sinclair basically writing books, Jane Addams setting up a settlement house. What is a settlement house? What is Hull House, which is the name of the settlement house Jane Addams founds in Chicago in the late 1880s? Well, it's a place where poor, normally immigrant women can come to learn child rearing, home economics, good hygiene, basically trying to teach these women skills so that they can improve their lives. Now, like many people, you have to look at both sides of the coin. On the one side, Jane Addams wanted to help these women, help these poor immigrant families make the transition to America. But it's based on the belief that there's something wrong with these individuals to start with, that they must be re-educated, that they must be Americanized. Jane Addams shared this sentiment with a man by the name of John Dewey. Now, John Dewey is the most influential person in the foundation of public education in this country, because before the 1890s, you did not have public education as we know it today. You had local schools before this time period, but the idea of state standards, for example, that dictate curriculum in every public school in the state, and then of course this is expanded in recent years to federal mandates that are carried through the Department of Education. This all comes from the ideas of John Dewey, because Dewey was not as much concerned with traditional education, but instead training people for the new industrial society, basically training young men and women to fit like cogs in a machine into the industrial machine that was created during this time period. Dewey also advocated public education because he believed that it would help Americanize the vast number of immigrants coming into this country. Now, this idea of social control and social management, as pointed out by historian Michael McGurr, is a key element, as you can see, in both the regulation of industry as well as the social uplift of individual. The idea of controlling individuals is also key to what becomes known as corporate welfare or welfare capitalism. Now, back then, corporate welfare was not the idea that the government gave subsidies to corporations and industries. That's something that the name corporate welfare means today. But back in the early 1900s, corporate welfare or welfare capitalism was the idea that business owners would provide, like Robert Owen, provide certain things, certain commodities, certain necessities, housing, education, food, to their workforce. But this gave these factory owners immense amounts of power over their workforce, because you don't dare stand up against, say, your supervisor, because you might get fired. And if you got fired, you lost your house. Your kid got kicked out of school. You might actually have to leave town because the entire town was dominated by one company, one factory. Why did factory owners want this? Well, they believed that on the one side, they were helping their workers. For example, in many factory towns, alcohol was banned. But on the flip side, this is a way of guaranteeing social control. Now, as the progressive era evolved, progressives realized that trying to change society, one issue, one industry, one aspect at a time, was too inefficient. What was necessary was a centralized governing body, government. This is why progressives in the latter stage of the progressive era turned to government oversight, government control of reform. The problem for progressives is what kind of government do they want in charge? Because the governments at the local, state, and even federal level in the late 1800s, progressives saw these governments as incredibly corrupt. This is best illustrated by the problems in New York of the corruption of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the name for the Democratic Party machine. It was located in Tammany Hall in New York City. The leader of Tammany Hall was, well, this vulture right here. In this editorial cartoon by Thomas Nast, Nast has William Boss Tweed painted as a vulture eating off the bones of New Yorkers. Progressives wanted to get rid of this kind of corruption. Instead, they wanted people of expert opinion. They wanted people trained in public administration to be in government. What is public administration? This is something relatively new. This is actually a creation of the progressive era. To understand where this idea of public administration comes from, we must understand the progressives themselves. Remember, the progressives were of this professional middle class coming out of the Industrial Revolution. These are individuals that their lives revolved around managing corporations. They were the people that were the accountants, were the lawyers, were the technical, they were the technicians and the engineers in the factories. And thus, their mindset was that of a scientific approach to government. Many of these individuals were heavily influenced by the ideas of scientific management put forward by Frederick Taylor. Now, Frederick Taylor was not a progressive. Frederick Taylor was a man who advised corporations on how to make their production, their manufacturing efforts more efficient. But the progressives took this idea that if you can scientifically manage industry, you can scientifically manage government and use government to manage society. This becomes known as the good government movement. And most of us don't recognize it, but we live in two cities here, in the twin cities of Maryville and Alcoa, are direct products of this good government movement. Let me put it to you guys this way. Maryville and Alcoa. Who actually runs the city governments? Well, since you're not here to answer me, I'll tell you. It's not the mayor. We have a city council, and we do have a mayor who acts as the head of the city council. But they pass laws, and they jack up taxes. But the day-to-day operation of Maryville and Alcoa is carried out by a city manager who is hired for his professional credentials to manage the cities, to take care of the police, to take care of fire, to take care of garbage pickup, to basically run the city. The purpose for having a city manager is that this person will rationally manage the operation of the city and not befall what was happening in New York under the governance of Boss Tweed here, where, garbage pickup was manipulated and budgets, budget accounts were skimmed off the top and things like that. You separate the management of the government from popular politics, because there's a reason why Boss Tweed was in power. He was popular. He got the votes. And the progressives didn't like that. They look upon democracy as, in some cases, destructive. Instead, what they want is a society, again, that is managed rationally. This, of course, is why you have both public and private regulation of society during the progressive era. Public regulation is best typified by, of course, the Food and Drug Administration, that it comes into being as part of that reaction to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. But you also have this idea of private regulation. Today, if I said, oh my God, it's vice, most people would say, oh, it's a part of the police department. However, in the early 1900s, so-called vice squads were not connected with the government. They weren't part of the police force. Instead, vice squads were private individuals who would, normally people from the middle class, who would go to areas of their cities where they lived, and they would take notes on vice, where people were drinking a lot, where prostitution was going on, where women were wearing short skirts. I mean, literally, they did stuff like that. And they would report it back to the government. but also publish it in local newspapers, thus forcing the hand of the government to react and, do something about this. So one of the things that comes out of the progressive era is things like the FDA. The United States has their first public schools. You start to see government oversight grow out of the progressive era. So today, the EPA regulates how much water your toilet flushes and what kind of light bulbs you can buy. If you're going to buy a firearm, it has to go through the ATF. Your car is regulated not only by the EPA in terms of emission standards, but you have safety regulations and all of this stuff. The precedent for these types of regulations that don't go through Congress, but instead are passed by these regulatory agencies, the precedent was set back in the progressive era. And it's continuing today because the progressives, instead of creating a political party, the so-called progressive party, most progressives instead operate through the two existing political parties. And at that time, it was still the Republicans and the Democrats. And so what you see born during this progressive period is not only the idea of government oversight, but also interest group politics, where interest groups lobby the party that is most receptive to their efforts to get their agenda passed. I would say that the progressives have been highly successful. Whether you agree with them or agree with their policies or not, they have had an effect upon our society. Now, next class period, of course, we are having our midterm. So ignore this right here because we have already talked about nationalism. I hope this remake of the last lecture, which was kind of problematic and it was kind of hard to watch. This is one reason why I'm redoing this. I hope this helps explain modern ideologies and how they come out of the Industrial Revolution and how they affect our modern world. I will see you guys on Monday. I hope you guys have a chance to watch this because it will be on the midterm. Good luck on the midterm and good luck studying. I'll see you guys then. Good night.